Good day. Depth is important. Why? Because if you actually can have investment in something, it actually has meaning, and if it has meaning, then it will be memorable. And one such memorable game from the late 90s is BattleTanx. With a name like that, you would think it would have a really silly story, a really stupid story, or no story at all. Instead, it has one of the most imaginative stories of the late 90s. So with that, let's tension our tracks and take a look at it.
BattleTanx was developed and published by the 3DO company? I just thought it was 3DO. Didn't know they were so fancy about it. And it was released to the gaming public on the transcendent Nintendo 64 on December 29th, 1998. What we got here, lads and lasses of the future, is a third-person vehicular combat game where you take control of a tanks, aka tank. You play as a manly man named Griffin as he does battle in a post-apocalyptic wasteland. Be patient, that story is off the bloody tracks. Wait, don't make me tension the tracks again, sir. No! At least it's not the Kettenkrod. The game is divided into 4 stage types. The first one is a free-for-all where you destroy a set number of tanks. Next, you gotta run a gauntlet and dodge tanks and tank traps to get to an exit. And finally, you gotta play Capture the Babe. Oh dear. Lastly, you control a tank that can only move left or right, and you try to hold out against waves and waves of tanks to get a high score. All the game types are pretty bloody fun, and there are a bunch of enemies to fight, and their AI is pretty decent. Not punishing, but they're not a pushover either. You can get a bunch of power-ups, including a guided missile that is not at all easy to steer, but still pretty impressive and fun to use. The levels are pretty large, and some of the buildings are destructible. It's a pretty straightforward time waster that is worth your time. As for me, I played the crap out of this game in the late 90s, but I never actually owned it or its much improved sequel, BattleTanx Global Assault, and just rented it a bunch of times. Despite that, it stuck in my head for years, and thanks to RetroArch, I can play it anytime I want. This series is sadly pretty obscure now, and it deserves some major love for being a really fun hidden gem on the greatest console of the late 90s. Screw you, PlayStation! Graphically, this game looks good on the N64, and all the cities and tanks look amazing. However, this comes at a cost. Some of the levels have really low frame rates. Like, I'm talking PowerPoint presentation here, people. I'm not sure if it was like that on the original N64 or something due to RetroArch, but some of these levels are just borderline unplayable. It is impressive that there's that many enemies and that the city's that big, but maybe they should have been a little less ambitious. Sound is alright. There is no real VA work, but the explosions sound good enough, and you can get immersed into the game. Music is alright, but none of the tracks are standout, and once again the sequel gives us much better beats. On original hardware, BattleTanx controlled quite well on the N64 controller, and the analog stick was quick and responsive, and the fire button was the Z key, and it felt like you were actually pulling a trigger. And when you play this on RetroArch with a modern controller, it works just as well. The N64 controller was truly a forward-thinking design, and could not be touched by the foul PlayStation. At least until the DualShock controller came out. Moving on. Alright, so, story. While this game's gameplay was good, it was nothing to really write home about. The story makes all the difference. And man, this story is, as the cool kids say, hits different. See, this game came out in the much more innocent days of 1998. The game's story is told in a comic book style, and I want to remind everyone that 1998 was too good for this benighted rock. This was a silly little game where you battled tanks. This story did not need to be this good. So, in January of 2001, oh dear, the CDC, oh dear, discovers a virus that is 99.9% deadly to the female population. Oh dear. The federal government of the United States makes an in-run around the pesky U.S. Constitution and begins stealing people's female family members for quarantine. Oh dear. Oh, and the murderous, wonderful and pure federal government opens fire upon and kills any male who tries to keep their female family members from the government. ACW2 ensues. Oh dear. As the military doesn't like the idea of government bureaucrats requisitioning their females. Enter Griffin and Madison. For some reason, they are living in the dank cesspit of New York City, and they decide to get married. Oh dear. Madison decides to let herself get taken, oh dear, by the federal officials so that Griffin will not be killed. Then on May 6th, due to the lack of the stabilizing influence of females, oh dear, the world comes to an end and nukes are used to get through No Nut November. We even get a bloody casualty title card that shows that 50 million dudes are now competing for 50,000 females. So no change there. Well, Griffin does not want his hot wife to become a thought, and so he takes Brandon's, and yes, when this game came out, Brandon was indeed in politics, advice to heart, and instead of an F-15, he picks up an M1A1 Abrams and sets out across the United States to the worst hive of scum and villainy the world has ever known. Communist Fornia, in order to rescue his wife from the foul clutches of Brandon and Harvey Weinstein. Oh, and the first level in the game is called Ground Zero? First, holy shit, this is a kick-ass story, and it's taken 100% seriously. Well, mostly. I don't think some of the developers had good communication with each other, because we have a very serious story, and then your tank has the license plate "Eat Me" on it. I'm not really sure if that really fits with the tone this game was going for, but hey, it was the 90s. This is why the 90s and early 2000s were so great. No game dev today would have the sheer sperm count to create a story that hardcore, especially for a silly little tank game. Now, young General Lotz was indeed blown away back in those days. Now, back in the 90s, this kind of story was not that unique. In fact, the post-apocalyptic genre had been popular since the 1980s. Back in the 80s and 90s, post-apocalyptic stories like this were really a dime a dozen. The specter of communism inspired writers to wonder what a post-nuclear world would look like. And once the foul socialists fell, as they always do, those same writers started thinking of other ways the world could be screwed. In the before times, we had series such as Deadlands, which was essentially Fallout but 80s instead of 50s, Earthblood, a world where no crops could grow due to a virus, and Warlord, a really silly series where Communist Fornia got booted from the mainland due to an earthquake. Good riddance. How horrible. BattleTanx's story fit right in, although the incel virus is a pretty imaginative way of screwing the world over. Giggity? And finally, holy shit, in 2024, well, all that stuff has a way different connotation. Pandemic, Federal Overstep, ACW2, World War III, bloody Ground Zero. Man, if only Palladium wasn't so expensive, I could get my time machine built and go back to the good old days when all that was just a fun story. Anyway, precious metal prices aside, in the game, you play as Peter Griffin as he treks across the blasted remnants of the United States to rescue his hot babe. While doing this, you fight gangs of psychos that somehow got their hands on tanks. Man, that's a lot of JP8. And I wonder, who is doing the track tensioning anyway? Griffin, as a family kind of guy, eventually forms his own army of liberation and makes a long march to liberate some sexy colonist daughters from the foul clutches of the post-apocalyptic gangs. This is the third game type, where you fight through a gang's lines, blow up their pimp mansion, and steal their girls that are hilariously represented by a 2D image of a hottie. I miss the 90s. Eventually, you fight to Communist Fornia. The cesspit of San Francisco was spared due to the nations of the world thinking it was already destroyed. It is currently in the hands of the Dark Alliance, a force made up of the Dark Angels, not to be confused with the 40k Spec Marine faction. Funny enough, they do wear dark cloaks, kind of like the Watchers in the Dark, but anyway, Griffin channels his inner Duke Nukem and ensures that no one steals his chicks. And lives. Eventually, the bastard sons of Luther are put to the sword, and the honor of the Dark Angels is redeemed, and Griffin gets some sweet sexy time, and is declared Battle Lord of Terra. The end. Greatest game story ever! This game shows why story is so bloody important, and the gameplay just isn't everything. The game is fun on its own, but with a story that bloody amazing, it puts all that tank blasting into an epic context that can and will stick in your mind for decades to come. If it was just tanks and no story, yeah, we would have had fun with it, but it would just as quickly been forgotten. Story is what takes a fun game and makes it a legendary one.
If you happen to be a youngin' or an honored elder like me, it's time to boot up that game and make the world safe for sexy time. I am General Lotz, wishing you good BattleTanx, Global Assault, and good Earthblood, or whatever makes you happy.
If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing, and please consider leaving a like or a comment, as the algorithm desires your soul. And I want to thank all those fans who have supported this channel, both past and present.